Ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to be here in Copenhagen and to open this symposium on Patrick Leigh Fermor. And as Charles said, the subject of my talk is why this trilogy, extraordinary trilogy, took so long to write. He was one of those people who seems too good to be true. No one wore their learning so lightly, and he responded with ease and generosity to everyone he met. His conversation ranged effortlessly through history, architecture, art, literature. He knew reams of poetry by heart, and he could sing songs, and these are just the ones I heard, in French, German, Romanian, Bulgarian, Italian, Dog Latin, and Hindi. He has been hailed as one of the great travel writers of the 20th century, and he ranks as one of the most original prose stylists in the English language. He was also a celebrated war hero who took part in one of the most dramatic episodes in the war, when in May 1944 he led the successful Anglo-Cretan operation that kidnapped a German general and whisked him away under the very noses of the enemy. All this, plus Byronic good looks, a glorious sense of humour, encyclopedic knowledge. No wonder his company enlivened every party, picnic or expedition he ever joined. As one of his old friends put it, if only Paddy came in pill form so you could take one whenever you felt depressed. Most of the time, it was the happy, confident Paddy who was in the ascendant, as you can see in this photo, taken in 1946 when he was 31. But he was human, like the rest of us. And when his thoughts turned inwards, he was prone to bouts of depression and feelings of failure. His output, though rare in quality, was slim, to say the least. As time went on, he regretted that he had never published a book about Romania, nor one about wartime Crete, and above all, he grieved for what he described as the ice age of writer's block, which had prevented him from finishing his trans-European trilogy, launched so triumphantly with A Time of Gifts. His early life, too, had been marred with more disappointment than success. Noisy and troublesome, a born breaker of rules, he had been expelled from school after school, culminating with the King's School, Canterbury, from which he was expelled for a number of peccadillos, including holding hands with the greengrocer's daughter. Sent to a crammer, he managed to scrape a pass in his school certificate, and when that was done, he took a room in one of the warren of little streets that make up the charming, rather disreputable quarter known as Shepherd Market in London. His parents, of course, hoped he would settle down and find a profession, and the army looked like a possibility. But Paddy was too wild and exuberant to do well in any institution, and besides, all he wanted to do was write. But as so many have found, getting started as a writer proved much harder than he thought. It was easier to have fun and go to pubs and parties, but soon they too began to pall, leaving nothing but an aimless, hopeless gloom. He was living in this house, number 28, Shepherd Market. That's where it all began. And where, on one rainy evening in the late autumn of 1933, he had an idea that would change everything. He would walk from the Hook of Holland to the city we know as Istanbul, but which Paddy always called by its Greek name, Constantinople. He was 18, and from that moment he was filled with a new purpose. Poring over the map, he planned an itinerary that would follow the paths of two great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. And after a farewell lunch with his landlady and a few close friends, he set off on the 9th of December, 1933. I'm now going to give a brief overview of the journey, concentrating on the last part, and then I'll talk about how the trilogy came to be written and why that final volume only appeared after his death. His aim was to abandon England, he wrote, and to set out across Europe like a tramp, or, as I characteristically phrased it to myself, a pilgrim, a palmer, an errant scholar, a broken knight. And if he lived frugally, sleeping in barns and ditches and on people's sofas, he reckoned he could get by on his allowance of £4 a month. But whatever happened, Travel would bring not only freedom and adventure, but something to write about. It was snowing in Holland, and in Germany, Hitler had been in power for only 9 months. Paddy was a political innocent, but it did not take him long to develop an instinctive loathing for the aggressive regimentation of the Nazis and the way they dismissed every point of view but their own. He had walked as far as Munich when disaster struck. His rucksack was stolen from the youth hostel, along with his money, passport, and diary. Thanks to Mr. Sinclair Gaynor, the first in a long line of very indulgent British consuls who have supporting roles in this story, the money and the passport were swiftly replaced. And here is the photo for that new passport, taken in January 1934. Now, I'd like you to note the signature that appears up the right-hand side. Michael Leigh Fermor. For the whole of this epic journey, he called himself by his second name, Michael. Paddy, never Patrick, by the way, Patrick was exclusively for the books and the articles, was the self that he'd left behind, that idle loafer who was never going to make anything of himself, while Michael was the brilliant, ambitious young writer and traveller that he wanted to become. Less easy, of course, to restore were his journal and the sketchbook. "I was aghast," he wrote in A Time of Gifts. "Those thousands of lines, the flowery descriptions, the pensées, the philosophic flights, the sketches and verses, all gone." These self-mocking lines were written 30 years later, but at the time it really did feel like a calamity. His identity as a writer in the making was all that lay between himself and his failure at school and his family's disappointed hopes. Also irreplaceable was his one letter of introduction, but luckily he remembered to whom it was addressed, Baron Reinhard von Liefert-Ratshof, who lived just outside Munich. His sons found Paddy another rucksack and filled it with all he would need, while the Baron wrote letters to several of his friends in Austria, Czechoslovakia and beyond, urging them to be kind to this amusing and original young Englishman. And so the walk continued. Now, this map shows the two great rivers, so he's going to go up the Rhine here and then down the Danube there. And he picks up the Danube at Ulm, and here in Munich, that's where the rucksack was stolen. He's going to go through Austria here and spend a lovely time in Vienna. Where's Vienna gone? Perhaps you can see it. There it is, there's Vienna. And then the only other thing I want to say is, yes, he's going to walk on into Czechoslovakia. Now, he bought another exercise book in Munich, which he was going to write all his jottings and journals in. And by the end of the walk, he had perhaps 3, 4 of these, we don't know, but only one survives, the so-called Green Diary. And he bought that where you can see Bratislava, there it is. He bought it there on the edge between sort of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Now, here are a couple of pages from that diary. If it's anything to go by, and actually it's all we've got to go by, he wrote his diary entries in the front of the book, while the back was kept for sketches, phrases, songs, addresses, maps, bits of vocabulary, different forms of lettering, anything. And Paddy admits that he was most assiduous in making a daily entry when he was alone and on the road. It was then that he most needed the company of pen and paper, the reassurance of his role as a literary vagabond, a sort of latter-day Villon or Baudelaire. These were the days of cheap hostels and sleeping in barns and haylofts, and the people he met were farmers and traders, priests and craftsmen, and peddlers and peasants going to market. But as soon as he came to a city, another side of Paddy would emerge. If he had contacts, he would look them up. If he didn't, he would have a shave and make his way to a smart cafe. Here he would sit with nursing a cup of coffee and a pile of newspapers in several languages. And within an hour or two, some curious soul was bound to engage him in conversation. And before long, he would find himself swept into a congenial circle of educated and cosmopolitan people. And now the scholar gypsy gave way to a more worldly figure, a young man eager for every experience, who enjoyed nightclubs and skiing and tennis, as well as talking about art and literature. But for much of 1934, he was not on the road, nor in a city, but staying in a series of country houses in eastern Hungary and western Romania. This is one of them. It's called Kapalnas, and it's in Transylvania, and his hosts here were Count and Countess Jenő Teleki. And during the spring and summer of 1934, when he was living in hospitable houses like this one, he wrote not one word. So why did he abandon his journals for all that time? He had already started the Green Diary, and it reveals a gap of 4 months from the end of March to mid-August 1934. Now, Paddy admits that he was enjoying himself very much, but he also felt uneasy, and not just because he was accepting an awful lot of hospitality from people he barely knew. His literary identity seemed somehow stifled by all this ease and pleasure. Now, of course, no one would grudge him a night or two of comfort, but was he really supposed to be staying with aristocratic landowners for weeks on end, being entertained and waited on hand and foot? This was the life of a young milord on the grand tour, not a wandering scholar. The more I enjoyed these miraculous weeks, he wrote, the more my conscience began to smite. Paddy was already feeling an uncomfortable dislocation between the pleasure-loving young man that he naturally was and the more poetic figure he felt he ought to be. And one of the last friendly houses he stayed in that summer was here at Guru Sada, also in Transylvania, where he was the guest of a Hungarian friend called Elemer Klobuzitsky. His time here is lovingly described in Between the Woods and the Water. And he recalls this very door. Green and purple panes glittered in a fanlight at the end of an arcade, he wrote. And the door beneath led to a loggia where we sat at night, looking out over a wide vista of timber and water. And I find it very moving that something as fragile as this coloured glass should have survived the twin catastrophes of war and communism that destroyed so much else. Paddy picked up his Green Diary again, as I say, in mid-August 1934, and with it we can follow the last third of the journey which took him to Constantinople and beyond. Most of the frontier between Romania and Bulgaria follows the Danube, and Paddy took a ferry from Orsova, which is up here, to Lom, which is on the Bulgarian side, and then he walked down here to the capital, Sofia. Here, thanks to an English girl he'd met on the ferry, he was invited to stay with a couple called Mr. and Mrs. Boyd Tollington, he being the British consul in Sofia. In his diary, Paddy notes what a comfort it was to be in an English household again, because he was often homesick and lonely on these journeys, moods barely alluded to either in A Time of Gifts or Between the Woods and the Water. And as we have the map, I'm just going to outline the next bit of the journey. He's going to go from Sofia down to Rila here, then back to Sofia, over to Plovdiv, and then, of course, Istanbul is not very far away, but he's going to go north to Târnăvăr, Rus, and then to Bucharest. But for now, let's catch up with him at the great monastery of Rila. Everyone for miles around had converged for the festival of St. John of Rila, who was one of the most important saints in Bulgaria, and whole families were camping out on those lovely green hills that you see beyond the walls. Paddy had been here for several days enjoying the festivities, and on the 4th of September, as he was coming back from a long walk in the mountains, he met a group of female students, one of whom was called Penka Krachanova. I would love to tell you that it was Penka who took this photograph of Paddy in the gateway of the monastery, but it could just as easily have been somebody else. But I do think Paddy was looking at it when, years later, he described his appearance at that time. I must have been an uncouth sight, with dust-clogged hair, rumpled clothes, a rucksack, also I blush now to set it down, but honesty compels it. A scarlet and yellow braid belt bought in Transylvania, a steel-hilted dagger, and a brown fur kalpak from the fair in Berkowice. I think you can just see the dagger at his belt. And I'm pretty sure this is Penka, the young student he met, and it's one of several portraits in the back of his green diary. She was studying French and wanted to look like a student at the Sorbonne. Hence the beret, Paddy tells us, which she wore at a terrific angle, and the look was completed with a white shirt and a black pleated skirt. Since her parents' death, she had lived with her grandfather in Plovdiv, and she enjoyed more freedom than was permitted to most Bulgarian girls in 1934. She and Paddy spent most of the coming days together, and Paddy described one day with her as the happiest I've ever spent. And when they parted, Paddy promised he would come and see her when he reached Plovdiv. But before turning east, he returned to Sofia, days which coincided with a conference on Byzantine studies. Now, Paddy had for some time been very intrigued by Byzantium. And in a cafe, he seized the opportunity to introduce himself to one of the most eminent Byzantine scholars of the time, the American archaeologist Thomas Whittemore, who had uncovered the Byzantine mosaics in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Paddy was fascinated by what Whittemore had to say about the art and history of Byzantium, and especially by his descriptions of Mount Athos and the monasteries there, where the Byzantine tradition still flourished. And Whittemore, pleased by the young man's interest, asked Paddy to look him up when he reached Constantinople. And Paddy left Sofia on September the 18th, and 2 days later he reached Plovdiv. Here he looked up Penka, and they spent 2 happy days exploring the town and cuddling in the municipal gardens. She took him to meet her grandfather, who was the first Greek person that Paddy ever met. And later Paddy took Penka to his hotel bedroom, where they spent an amorous afternoon, he notes in his diary. And a little further on he writes, "Am feeling sentimental tonight, as am leaving tomorrow." Oh, he doesn't tell us how poor Penka felt. But why am I boring you with this little romance? Only because I've told you how it appears in the diary. It's going to look very different when he comes to tell the story again 30 years later. From Plovdiv, Paddy was only about 140 kilometers from the Turkish border, but he was in no hurry, and now he turned north. After Karlovo, he climbed up to the Shipka Pass and went over the great Balkan range that straddles Bulgaria from east to west, and he spent the night at this monastery, which commemorates the Russo-Bulgarian victory over the Turks in 1871. And then he walked on to Tirnovo, the old capital of the Bulgarian Tsars, which clings to the edge of a gorge overlooking the river Yantra. By now, he was down to his last few coins, and there was no money waiting for him at the post office. But although his money had run out, his luck still held. He was befriended by a young student called Georgy Gatchev, known as Gacho, whose father had a khan, which is a simple inn with a courtyard for people's animals. And the more well-to-do khans had a little sort of general store, like that of Gacho's father. Paddy stayed with the family for several days, occupying the bed of Gacho's brother, who was doing military service. And Gacho lent him some money. He also took Paddy drinking with his friends, who introduced him to hashish and taught him Bulgarian songs. But when Paddy announced that he planned to visit Romania again in order to visit Bucharest, Gacho was furious. The Romanians were thieves and liars, and they'd stolen the Dobruja. The Dobruja is this bit up there which had been ceded to Romania after the First World War. How could Paddy, who should be feeling like a Bulgarian by now, talk so casually about visiting Bulgaria's mortal enemies? But they patched it up, and Gacho made Paddy promise that he would come and visit him in Varna, where he was a student at the German school. So Bucharest is up there, and then he's going to go down here to Varna and walk down this coast, and he hopes to go all the way down like that. Bucharest. Paddy had a wonderful time. He stayed with Josias von Rantzau, a German diplomat who had watched the rise of Nazism with horror and was close to many of those involved in the plot to kill Hitler 10 years later. And thanks to Josias and his friends, Paddy found himself in borrowed evening clothes, drinking and dancing with the cream of Bucharest's high society. He was very sad to leave these delightful new acquaintances, and perhaps to soften the blow of returning to the wandering scholar's life, he decided to take a train to Varna, where he caught his first sight of the Black Sea. Gaccio was delighted to see him again. Paddy shared Gaccio's room in the student hostel. But when Paddy started spending time with another, dare I say it, English consular family he'd met, Gaccio became so jealous that one evening he attacked Paddy with a knife. They were both pretty drunk at the time, so no harm was done. But the combination of insensitivity on Paddy's part and Gaccio's violent moods left them feeling uncomfortable. They healed the breach, and at the end of November, when it was time to leave, Gaccio and 12 of his friends accompanied him on the first few dozen miles of his walk to the along the south coast. They spent the evening at a rough tavern called the Fisherman's Hut, where there was a lot of drinking and dancing, and Paddy noted the names and drew pictures of the musical instruments that were played. And as you see, it's a beautiful stretch of coastline, and Paddy enjoyed the walk, but by the time he reached Burgas, some 80 miles further south, he was shivering uncontrollably and felt very ill. He had contracted malaria, which is endemic in this part of the world. Luckily, he had an introduction to, yes, you've guessed it, another British consul. And he and his wife nursed Paddy through the illness, and he stayed with them in Burgas for Christmas 1934. Paddy decided that he would like to spend New Year's Eve in Constantinople. And it was only on leaving Burgas that he realized that the bit between Edirne here and Istanbul was what was called a sensitive demilitarized zone. In other words, it was bristling with Turkish soldiers who might fire at anything, so crossing it on foot was out of the question. He was obliged to travel the rest of the distance by train, and years later he wrote that he was bitterly disappointed at not being able to walk the last few miles of his long journey. But notes in his green diary reveal that actually he didn't mind that much at the time. Paddy arrived in Constantinople on New Year's Eve and spent most of January 1935 in the city. He had a Turkish bath. He bought himself an amber cigarette holder. He met some hospitable Greeks and found a girlfriend. But although he was now at the heart of Byzantium, his brisk diary entries do not mention any of the great Byzantine sites of the city, and strangest of all, he didn't look up Professor Whittemore. And I remember asking Paddy why not, and he seemed equally puzzled. Why? Why didn't I? He said, exasperated at having missed such an opportunity. I can't think why I didn't. I suppose I must have been in a very odd mood. Now, the end of the journey is always an anticlimax and a time for taking stock, and there was much to be proud of. He had learnt the rudiments of German and Romanian. He was a seasoned traveller. He had made friends all over Europe, friends, incidentally, that he would revisit often in the years before the war. But everything he'd been running away from when he left London was still there. He was no closer to finding a job, or even to becoming a writer. It was in Constantinople that he made his first attempt to write up the journey, hoping that his prose would bear comparison to those of the authors he admired, like Norman Douglas, Robert Byron, Harold Nicholson, but he was forced to admit that he was still very much a beginner. As time went on, Paddy began to realize that this journey had set the course of his life, but his month in Constantinople was haunted by a sense of disappointment which soured the whole city. Years later, he wrote that every time he left Constantinople, it was as if a great weight was being lifted from his chest. The one thing he was not going to do was go home. His allowance of £4 a month went far further in Eastern Europe than it did in the West, and he knew it would continue until he was 21, so he still had another year of freedom left. And in Constantinople, he had resolved to visit the monasteries of Mount Athos, and on the 24th of January, he boarded a ferry to Salonika, which stopped here at the little port of Daphne, which is the gateway to the Holy Mountain. Paddy spent 4 weeks on Mount Athos, visiting most of the monasteries, and the journal he kept at this time, which begins in the Green Diary and continues over about 40 loose pages, was written at length and in detail. This was partly because there was nothing else to do. He was often on his own because the monks spent so much time in prayer, but they did help him with his early efforts to master Demotic Greek. Soon after leaving Mount Athos, with the reluctant help of an officer in the Greek army called Peter Stathatos, Paddy borrowed, in inverted commas, one of his friend's horses and tagged along with units from the Royalist army as they mopped up a minor Republican rebellion in the ranks. The high point was a gallop over this bridge across the river Struma, with all guns blazing, even though, of course, all the rebels had vanished. The next few weeks were spent exploring the wilds of Thrace and Macedonia, and for those of you who remember Rumeli, this is where he had his first encounters with the Sarakatsani, those aristocrats of the Greek nomadic world. And then he took a bus to Athens, where he met the first great love of his life, a Romanian princess called Balasha Cantacuzene. She was a painter who had been married to a Spanish diplomat, and she was 16 years older than Paddy. And I think she taught him an enormous amount. These were kind of the equivalent of his university years. She was enormously well-read in French literature. He read a huge amount. And I like to think, too, that she sanded off a few of his rougher edges. They spent the next 4 years together between London, Greece, and her family home at Baleni, on the eastern border of Romania. And Paddy was staying there when war broke out in September 1939, and he immediately made plans to return to England and join up. And such was his eagerness to go to war that he left the Green Diary in this house with Balasha. Now, I briefly mentioned the celebrated kidnap of the general, but Chris White is going to actually knows far more about this part of his life and is going to give us a wonderful account of it. So I'm going to move on. In fact, I'm going to skim rapidly over the next 25 years. By the time the war ended, he had met Joan Ayres-Munsell, a remarkable photographer who eventually became his wife. And in the late 40s, they travelled to the islands of the Caribbean, which became the subject of Paddy's first book, The Traveller's Tree. More books followed: A Time to Keep Silence, which is a contemplation on monastic life, The Violins of Saint-Jacques, his only novel, and The Cretan Runner, Paddy's translation of the war memoirs of his friend George Sikundakis. Paddy and Joan spent much of the early 1950s travelling around the remotest parts of Greece, and Joan took the photographs for Paddy's 2 books on that country, Mani and Rumeli. She also took this one, which is one of my favourites. They had long dreamed of settling in Greece, and in the early 1960s, they found the ideal spot, a headland facing due west on the coast between 2 little bays, just south of the village of Kardamili in the Mani. And they were still negotiating the purchase of the land, which is always rather tortuous business in Greece, when the American travel magazine Holiday, which is actually a more serious magazine than it sounds, asked Paddy to write a long article on the pleasures of walking. A good moment, Paddy thought, to write about his great trans-European trek. It was admittedly quite a long walk across 9 different countries, but you could still give a flavour of it in 5,000 words, and Paddy thought it could be done with a bit of compression. It was only as he began to write that he realised just how much he had to say. And as he went on, he found that having to keep his prose so tightly constricted became more and more frustrating. He had got to the Romanian-Bulgarian border when something snapped. And if you look at the right-hand page and you see those stars, after this, where he says at Orsova, from now on, he's writing at normal pace, no more compression. But the piece was no longer an article. It was expanding into a book, which came to be called A Youthful Journey. It's not quite complete, since the text stops in mid-sentence when Constantinople is still 2 or 3 days away. But yes, it is a draft of that 3rd volume of the trilogy, that elusive 3rd volume that was to cause him so much anguish. and it was written between 1963 and 1964, over a decade before the publication of A Time of Gifts. By now, the editors of Holiday magazine had been waiting 2 years for their 5,000-word article, and they must have been very annoyed when Paddy told them they weren't going to get it after all because it had turned into a book. But they decided to give him another chance, and in 1965, they commissioned Paddy to write a piece on the Danube, from its source in Germany to its bird-haunted delta on the Romanian coast of the Black Sea. And Paddy leapt at the opportunity, for though they had exchanged the occasional letter, he had not seen Balázsa Cantacuzène since he'd left her to go to war in 1939. And as we have this useful map, I might add that Balázsa's family estate at Baléni was somewhere up here between the River Prut and Moldova, and there's Bucharest, from which he's going to start, and they're living, the Cantacuzènes, in a little town here called Pucioasa. It's a little town in the foothills of the Carpathians, about 100 miles north of Bucharest. Being aristocrats, the Cantacuzènes had lost almost everything under the communist regime. The family house and estates at Baléni had been confiscated, and Balázsa had been caught trying to get out of Romania by boat, after which she spent 2 terrible weeks in prison. Then she, her sister, and her brother-in-law were allocated an attic flat here in Pucioasa, where they survived by teaching English and French. Now, Romania was beginning to open up a little bit in the mid-1960s, but fraternizing with foreigners could still get you into very serious trouble. So Paddy was taken to Pucioasa after dark by Balázsa's niece, Ino Donici, on the back of her motorbike. This photo of Balázsa was taken just after the war. But adversity, anxiety, and premature deafness had aged her considerably by 1965, and Paddy was dismayed to see how broken and ill she looked. He spent the next 24 hours in the family's flat. Nobody slept. The time was too precious. And while he was there, Balázsa put into his hands the diary that he had left behind in 1939. She had kept it safe all those years, and on the night of their eviction from Baléni, when she and her family had been given 15 minutes to pack, she had remembered to throw this book into the one little suitcase they were allowed to take. Paddy was hugely excited and grateful to have the Green Diary back, because by this time he knew that all his other diaries and all the letters that he'd written to his mother over the course of the journey had been lost forever. And he thought it was going to unlock the past, but as he read it, he was deeply shaken, more than he could ever admit, by the way the original diary and a youthful journey diverged. And a perfect example is the story of Penka Krachanova, the girl with the beret. In A Youthful Journey, he has renamed her Nadezhda. And she and Paddy stay in her house with a divan and windows overlooking the rooftops. And in this hanging glass box, as he calls it, he and Nadezhda have mock sword fights, and she dresses up in beautiful old clothes from an old Turkish chest. It's a fantasy, a capriccio, and infinitely more romantic and lyrical than the record he left in the diary. He had also worked up a dramatic story of getting lost as darkness fell on a stretch of jagged rocks and treacherous pools on the edge of the Black Sea, which is not all sandy beaches. Wet through, frozen to the bone, his hands and shins torn and bleeding, he stumbles into a cave full of Greek fishermen and Bulgarian shepherds. Now, as with the Penka Nadezhda story, it is loosely based on real events. His visit to the fisherman's hut with Gacho and his friends, and another time when he did get badly lost on the coast of Mount Athos. Paddy has taken these two events and turned them into a piece of fiction. So perhaps it's not surprising, faced with this chasm between the facts recorded in the diary and his imaginative recreations of them in A Youthful Journey, he put them both to one side and began the story of the war all over again from the beginning. In A Time of Gifts, he writes about the Green Diary at some length, although it doesn't cover the stretches of the journey described in either of these books. He tells how it dropped into his life, how he found its contents both exciting and disturbing. But while he goes on to quote 2 pages of it, almost verbatim, even now he couldn't resist correcting, one feels that they are bolted on rather than absorbed into the text. Now, this might not have mattered if Paddy had not been such a perfectionist, but he was. He corrected and rewrote his texts obsessively. The pages you see here come from the introduction to A Time of Gifts, and his publisher, John Murray, would show them to anyone rash enough to ask why Leigh Fermor was taking so long to finish his next book. Strata of writing are folded and overlaid with painstaking skill, richly detailed in some passages, deliberately blurred in others, hilariously funny one moment, and deliberately blurred in others. He remains intimately connected with his younger self while never losing sight of the older man who's doing the writing. And the overall effect is a vision of a timeless Europe suspended somewhere between memory and imagination. And the books are also a lament for everything that was swept away by those twin catastrophes of the 20th century, war and communism, for a way of life that revolved around the seasons, for the customs and traditions that had grown out of it, and for the friends he loved whose families and homes and lives were wrecked in the upheaval. And it's interesting that Paddy's only novel, The Violins of Saint-Jacques, written in 1953, is also an elegy for a vanished past. In it, the narrator meets an old woman, Berthe, who conjures up for him the glittering society that lived on the Caribbean island of Saint-Jacques-des-Élysées, and how, in the course of a single night, the whole island and all of its inhabitants were destroyed in a massive volcanic eruption. But returning to 1976, Paddy was delighted by the success of A Time of Gifts. This is his first real bestseller, and the enthusiasm of his readers. The last words of the first book are "to be continued," although his loyal fans had to wait another 9 years for Between the Woods and the Water. When it came out in 1986, the general consensus was that the wait had been worthwhile, and this second volume ended with the implacable words, "to be concluded." So what happened to that final volume? Several baleful influences were at work. I think the very success of the first 2 volumes had encouraged a sense of expectation, and almost everyone he met from now on said, "How are you getting on with Vol 3? We must also not forget that by 1986, when Between the Woods and the Water was published, Paddy had been working on his trans-European walk for over 2 decades, and I think part of him was just simply written out. But the main stumbling block was still what it had been in 1965, when he reread the green diary that Balasha had preserved. The Bulgarian part of the walk, as told in the diary, was so different in tone and texture to the same passage recreated decades later, and he somehow couldn't bring them together. But at the same time, he felt he had to be true to them both. And he hints at this dilemma in the last unfinished sentences of A Youthful Journey. So, wrote Paddy, instead of piecing together these fragments by memory, I'm surrounded by a windfall of day-to-day jottings, too rough and abbreviated to be used as they stand, and in some ways this abundance is a bit of an embarrassment. To make use of it all would mean a change of focus, a shift in key. And beneath those anxious words lurked another old malaise, for the diary not only noted the facts of the journey, but it had also revealed the gap between the 19-year-old Paddy, as he then was, cocky, Anglo-centric, sometimes touchingly vulnerable, and the more rounded, poetic, literary figure that Paddy's mature writing had turned him into. And there's nothing odd or unusual about this. I dare say many of us would blush to reread the stuff we wrote when we were 19. I know I would. And Paddy still found it impossible to reconcile the naked facts of the diary and his moments of imagination and fiction. And I think the very existence of the diary was at the heart of his writer's block and made it impossible for him to finish the trilogy. Sometimes I wondered whether he was ever tempted to throw it into the fire, leaving him as free as he'd been when writing the first 2 volumes. But I don't think that thought really ever crossed his mind. By then, the diary had acquired a significance that far outweighed its contents, and he could not throw away what Balasha had saved from the wreckage of her home and her life. So the years passed, and deadlines came and went. John Murray died in 1993, and Joan, Paddy's wife, died a decade later. And with their deaths, the last volume seemed to sink even deeper into oblivion. I began writing Paddy's biography in 2004, a year after Joan's death. And at that stage, he would not let me read the Green Diary. And he also asked me not to look at the 3 black ring binders, enticingly labelled Vol 3, which were in his study. I'd really rather you didn't, he said. It's all got to be unpicked. And he looked so wretched and downcast that I hadn't the heart to press him further. Then in 2007, I discovered a typescript of a youthful journey in the John Murray Archive in London, and I immediately dispatched a copy to Paddy in Greece. And he must have forgotten that he already had the manuscript lodged in those 3 black ring binders that I hadn't been allowed to look at. So he was delighted, treating this as a work long lost and now rediscovered. Paddy was now in his 90s, and he suffered from tunnel vision, which meant that he could only see a few words of text at a time. Olivia Stewart, a close friend who had been an invaluable support to Paddy after Joan's death, realised that this was his last chance to finish the book. And with Paddy's permission, she typed up both the Green Diary and A Youthful Journey and printed them out in an enormous font. Paddy was fired up with a new determination. He asked me to send him some large-scale maps of Romania and Bulgaria and a Bulgarian dictionary. Whenever anybody asked me whether the fabled 3rd volume would ever appear, I replied that Paddy was hard at work on it, which was true. But I also feared that he no longer had the energy to build up those magical layers of memory and learning and imagination anymore. And the changes he did make to the text were really pretty minimal, replacing one word by another. So here is the 3rd volume of that extraordinary walk, which came out in 2013, 2 years after his death. It is the text of A Youthful Journey from Orsova onwards, plus the account of his days on Mount Athos written at the time. And I still feel so sad that he never saw how enthusiastically it was received. It doesn't have the high polish of the first 2 books, but it's every bit as vivid, and at certain points, young Paddy feels pain, loneliness, anger, boredom even, emotions that he barely permitted himself in the first 2 books, and I think they make The Broken Road all the stronger. So would he have wanted it published, you may well ask? While he was alive, the answer would have been no, I'm still at work on it. Yet he never asked any of those around him to suppress the typescript in any way, let alone destroy it. And by the time of his death, he'd put in so much work on the texts that their relegation to an archive seemed wrong. The Broken Road may not be precisely the 3rd volume he was aiming for, the one that tormented him for so many years, but it contains at least the shape and scent of that elusive book. Thank you very much.